Welcome to another episode of Built by Us, the podcast where we explore the stories and insights of local entrepreneurs who are making a difference in our community. I'm your host, Jamie Arroyo, CEO of Assets. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Issac Etter, a social entrepreneur, speaker, and advocate for racial equity. Issac has made a significant impact through his work in adoption, foster care, and social justice. You can learn more about Issac and his inspiring journey at issacetter.com. Let's dive into our conversation and hear how Issac is driving change right here in our community.
Man, I feel like the origin story is, I was adopted when I was 2, but I feel like the origin story is actually a little bit before that. Before I was placed for adoption, I hear stories of struggling with, homelessness and poverty and different things that led to me being placed for adoption, which I find to be a significant part of my story, actually. Like kind of being born into that kind of situation, having that also be the cause of me being placed for adoption, which feels like another injustice, right? And so just being born into what feels like deep poverty, to the point of my birth mother feeling like she couldn't raise me and then placing me for adoption. And being adopted has been beautiful, right? Like it's a beautiful part of my journey to not have to grow up in foster care, even though it's led to a lot of struggles itself. So kind of starting at that point of being born into this kind of poverty situation to a teenager, being her feeling like she had no other choice but to place me for adoption, and then being adopted by a great family. It's kind of, I think my story starts with a lot of kind of like parallels, right? Like this kind of deeply sad thing and this deeply positive thing, right? My parents are wonderful people. I didn't have a bad upbringing by any means, but I think a lot of people, when we think about adoption, forget that those two moments live within minutes of each other. They live so close to each other. And so the same day that I was actually brought to the adoption agency that I was placed through was the same day that my parents came to inquire to adopt. So it's a cool part of my story, but I think it also adds to that, the weight of a mother placing her child for adoption, because she feels like there's no other survival option, with the joy of my parents coming to see if this is how they're going to build their family. I think it's a good way to put, like, in a sense, my origin into like one story. Because growing up, I was the only black kid in the community. And so I really struggled with a lot of identity issues, like understanding myself, understanding my story. And even as I got a little bit older and there were kind of like 3 or 4 other adopted kids who were black, there were still so few of us that was a really big part of my story and trying to figure out where I fit in and being insecure. And also from an early age, I really understood adoption. I think I have I wish I could not think a lot of the time. And so even from the time I was like 5, 6, I've just not been able to shut down my brain. And I put together really, really quickly that like for me to be adopted meant that somebody chose that, like somebody chose to place me for adoption. And so there was always a lot of deep insecurity. There was always a lot of rejection issues because of that. From the time I was like 6, 7, like not from like later in life, like just early in life, really feeling like, wow, like maybe there's something wrong with me. And so that's carried me. I mean, that's carried me into today, but especially as I went into elementary and teen years, struggling with like depression and mental health things and even like suicidal things, just because I felt like my worth was so small. And I feel like, especially as I went into adulthood, I was still dealing with that. Like I was still graduating high school, still going out into the world and still dealing with these feelings of feeling very small, like very insignificant. While kind of on the other hand, being like very big, like always being a very big visionary, like always, like from the time I was young, being so into my ideas, so into what I was interested in. Like I was really into music in high school, so I recorded a ton of music. I ran a record studio out of my parents' basement. Like I really wanted to have a record label one day. Like I still had these big bold dreams, but there was this really deep layer of like feeling like I was really invaluable underneath. And so when I went into college, kind of still struggling with these things, and still trying to figure out where I fit into the world. Now meeting people that look like me that came from Black homes for really the first time in my life. So struggling with that part of my like adoption, racial identity with like, now I'm an adult, like I'm trying to build relationships, I'm trying to date, I'm trying to do all these things, and finding that layer of insecurity, that layer that was so defined by being placed, showing up more and more and more. And I became an entrepreneur like really young. So like I went to college for like a year and a half, and then I dropped out. I lived in Georgia for a year to find myself. And then I came back when I was like 19 and a half. And I went right into building stuff. And so you could say I was an entrepreneur before that with like the record stuff and studio stuff, but like that was when I knew that I was becoming an entrepreneur. And I would say like underneath all of that, I was still trying to wrestle with myself. Like if there's like I don't know, your example, like Bruce Wayne to Batman, it's like there's been a huge battle my whole life, and probably still in some ways, of like beating the man in the mirror. Because the man in the mirror for such a long time, or maybe the boy in the mirror, really believed they were unlovable for a long time. And so even early into my entrepreneurship journey, with the first thing I created, which was Lancaster Together, which was like kind of like a really small idea. I'm not sure if we even knew each other, that we might have met around that time, which was a really small thing. I noticed like the idea of success, like me fighting that. And so when that kind of was finished or kind of dissolving, tailed right into when I started in adoption stuff. So Lancaster Together did this event on adoption and foster care, and that's how adoption agencies first found out about me. An adoption agency asked me to come and share my story at their cultural training, and I volunteered for months until the social worker told me, like, this is what you should do. Like, I don't know what else you're doing, but like, this is what you should do for a career. And that kicked me into the adoption world. So I was, I don't know, 19 and a half, 20. I think I was 20 at this point. And now I'm finally in this adoption arena. Now I'm not only kind of like this young person trying to figure out who I am, but I'm also now like working in a pretty vulnerable part of my life, a part of my life that I hadn't really like addressed. I was just now working in it randomly. And so like entrepreneurship is like undoubtedly full of an immense amount of rejection. And so if you have problems with rejection, then they're constant. And so I just remember like trying to like showcase that I do this now, and just like no after no after no, getting ghosted, like no email back, nobody wanting to pay me, and how crazy of a time that was to go through as somebody who already struggled with rejection issues. And just like having to face that like really, really boldly. But still feeling like I was supposed to do this, so just kind of charging on. And so I kept going. I have been a cold email wizard forever. And so I would cold email, I'd cold LinkedIn, I'd do whatever I could to get a speaking gig and to get in front of families. And it grew. Like, oddly enough and strangely enough, it kept growing. More and more people would find out about me, more and more agencies would find out about me. And so I started to kind of have a little bit of a name going into 2020, 2021. And then I feel like, I don't know if I changed or if the circumstances changed, but I was really interested in running a different kind of company. Like I would been on Twitter a lot, watching like tech companies evolve and watching kind of like that early tech era on Twitter evolve. And I was really like, man, I feel like I could do something in adoption like this. And so in 2021, in May of 2021, I went to Atlanta for a weekend, and I just sat in a hotel room and wrote the like original plan for identity. And that started the next wave of, I think, just going to war with myself, actually. And I didn't realize that when I did it. When I did it, I kind of thought, oh, this is just a great idea. It's very innovative. People will like it. It'll be successful. And I thought it would be successful really quickly because I was stupid. And so I went immediately into kind of just like thinking, okay, this is going to work, pushing, and losing again. Like running into a ton of rejection again. Presenting this idea that I felt was really good to modernize what's called post-placement support for adoptive and foster families. I thought people would just sign up for it. I was like, if we take all of this and make it on an app for a family, that seems like a great idea. And in theory, it is still a pretty good idea for parents to be able to have parenting resources on the go, on the fly, through whichever agency or state they're placing through. But people just didn't like the idea that much. And so I just kept hearing no, like over and over and over, from the main people that I was trying to sell it to. Not to mention I was trying to pitch it too. So like I was trying to raise capital around it, and I was learning how bad I was at pitching, like how bad I was at selling, how bad I was at all these things. And so I'd just gone through like one phase of rejection and finally kind of built a name, and like people wanted me to speak finally. But now I'm trying to do this next thing, and I'm experiencing a whole nother phase of rejection. And that one was way more brutal. Like that one was like leaving pitch calls and crying, like kind of brutal. And that happened for months, for actually like a year and a half it happened. And I think the thing that emerged out of that feels like the coming into like the superhero mode of it was just becoming so unafraid. Like at some point or another, I mean, you don't have to, but I think if you want to build like a great company or a great brand, that the fear has to be so quiet that you're able to do the big, bold things. And I don't know what broke exactly. And I think it might be products starting to work or people starting to buy in, but something broke kind of as I stopped pitching it to be like an investment, stopped trying to sell it the way that I was selling it, and just leaned into the parts of it that I felt were really dynamic, and just really stopped being afraid. I was like, I've already lost. Like, I have no money right now. Like, there were things that happened because I was so dedicated to the idea. Like, there was so much money I lost. Like, an apartment I almost lost. Like, literally, eviction was knocking at my door at one point because I was so invested in building this one thing that when I stopped and I actually just stepped back and did the thing that I thought maybe would just work, the walls came down and I was able to run. And so I don't know. I feel like that's a very runabout way of talking about this, but yeah, I guess that's the transition. Like the rejection has made the company great. And that has all been a personal journey. Like, you can build a great company by being smart and strategic and being a good manager and hiring well and having management skills and capital. I think to build a great brand, to be a great founder, you have to go through a different journey. One that is very much so like almost like being in the gym, right? It's like every single workout makes you stronger and stronger and stronger. And you don't have to have a good company and be like a public founder, right? Like, people build things all the time that are successful that don't have like this very forward-facing founder. But I found that with our brand and with what we're trying to do, I carried the beginning part of it. I carried the weight of that. And it was losing because I wasn't strong. And so, like, as I started to like actually build the muscle and lean into who I was and lean into my personality, it got better. And that didn't mean that I had to carry it all. It just meant that more people loved it. Like, more people felt real about it. And I've had a really, really hard time my whole life showing my personality, like letting people really see me. And so, like, over the last 2 years, really knocking down that wall and kind of being much more crazier publicly has really helped the brand, like has really helped people just see me as not only a founder and a visionary, but also as somebody who can carry this vision into the next decade. And I think what we're doing at Identity is really reshaping the future of adoption education. And honestly, I think we'll reshape the future of adoption and foster care in general. But that only started to become true, and that only became real when I knocked down my own walls and started, I don't know, leaning into what I felt like were my powers.
Yeah. And would you say that power is vulnerability?
I would say it's vulnerability, and it's also patience. And I've learned that more and more about myself. Like, the things that I'm working on today, I had the ideas for them 3 or 4 years ago. Like, I've been very, very patient. And I've been really strategic at knowing how to move what I call the pieces down the board. We talked about chess stuff, but I've been moving pieces down the board for years. Just moving my own brand and Identity's brand in a direction that can do more. identity was very hyper focused on interracial adoption stuff, transracial adoption stuff. And I always knew that that was a pigeonhole for us. Like I knew that that wasn't a smart move for us to get stuck in, because that there was room to grow, but there wasn't a ton of room to grow. And this year we put out a guide on adoption after infertility, highest rated product, like most reviews, most unique product we have by far. And it's moving us in the line. But that's a strategy I had 3-4 years ago. I just needed the transracial adoption stuff to get to a financial point to where I could push the next piece down. And so I think my biggest skills are actually patience. I can be vulnerable all day and night, and that's certainly a power of its own. But when you're patient and you're moving the pieces down the line and you don't need the reward right away, that's to me where things start to get fun. And I'm just now getting to see things get really fun. Yeah.
That's great to hear. For those listening, and you're interested in starting a business, I feel like chess is the game to learn.
Of course.
Talk about patience, strategy, and I tell people it's like thinking 4, 5, 6 moves ahead and not knowing when you're actually going to execute on them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's that, and I almost feel like I wish that we could almost split business into two halves, because there's so many people who create businesses that aren't as intense, but I'm a very intense person. So I almost want to like give like a warning that like this is for people who really want to build like really intense businesses and be really hard on themselves, because you can start all kinds of businesses and be very kind of like normal. I have lived a very abnormal, and I know you have as well, like very abnormal lives that are full of like thinking 4 or 5 moves ahead, like working on ourselves, dedication, and facing that rejection, which I think is what kind of helps you pave the way to something larger.
But don't you think, I think rejection is probably the number one fear for most entrepreneurs, and why they don't either take the next step in their career or even decide to start a business. So how did you find a way to overcome that rejection over and over again, especially when it started as early as when you were born?
Yeah, I'm extremely delusional. Like to a fault.
I probably shouldn't laugh at that, but that was a confident answer.
I'm extremely delusional from a very young age. And it's, to me, actually, it's that I think I just split off. Like I already know that it's coming. Like it's funny. People talk to me today and they're like, just so you know, like, when you started this, like, we thought you were insane. I was like, yeah, I probably was. But I think if you're an entrepreneur, you really want to do something, you can either like charge against the rejection, or you can just kind of decide that it's going to come and just split off from it. So like, I just split off from it. Like I allow it to almost live in its own parallel. And I just know the mission and I charge ahead. It's kind of like going to like war, right? It's like you get your mission and you go, and you know, if you end up in a battle zone and you die, like that's what it is, right? That might be a brutal analogy, but like that's just what it is, and you don't get to choose that. And so I try to think about it in that lens. Like if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna just go. And it's going to come, like the rejections are going to come, but if I want to stay down the path and I want to follow it through, I just have to go.
Yeah. You have to be okay with losing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece that most people aren't comfortable with, is that, you're charging ahead. I have made the decision to commit, and I have to be okay with failure, losing, getting evicted. Like I am okay with those outcomes. It's not, the delusion part comes, this might work.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And that's exciting, and that has to be enough for us to get fired up to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And I have to be just as fired up to know that I could lose in this. And that's okay.
And that you could win and lose, actually. That you could like win and then lose.
And it might be both and.
I think that's the worst one, actually, that people don't get prepared for, is that you can have a lot of wins that are then tailed by losses. And it can almost like distort it, but it's also a part of it. Is that like just winning in business are not on like a straight line. You don't kind of like overcome a mountain just to like glide the rest of the way. There tends to be like a new mountain in every season, which could require a new loss in every season. And most of the time I think will, as you kind of evolve and grow into wherever you want to continue to go.
Yeah. I don't think this is the right term, but I'm going to coin it now. Fear forecasting. So like thinking about what is the worst thing that can happen, and almost like, so we talk about visioning as for entrepreneurs, right? So you want to envision the bright future, the big company, the successes. And I think there's sometimes value in visioning the worst case scenario and embodying that almost, and then thinking, okay, now what would I do after that?
Absolutely. You should fear cast and you should reality cast at the same time. Like I talked about being delusional just because like that's how I rock. But like I try to also reality cast a lot too, just to give some perspective to the mix, right? Because I think you have to be overconfident. You have to believe in something that you can't see and all those things to win. And you also have to be aware of the fears, like if I lose all my money, how will we survive? You have a family and all these things. Fear casting is good. But if you reality cast, you have an ability to think very critically about the kind of life that you want. And I find that to be the area that most entrepreneurs fail and are not doing. It's really, really fun to think about building a good business, a big business, having employees and all these things. Most people do not want that life. And that's not to say that they couldn't handle that life or that they shouldn't do those things if they feel like doing them. But most people really don't realize how hard those things are. Like hiring is like it's a whole thing. Like hiring in like your mind sounds fun. Hiring in reality is a nightmare. And so like there's all these different things that come up when you're entering this game of entrepreneurship that I think that as much as you're kind of dreaming and as much as you're like making sure that you're aware of like what could be the losses, you should also be really hyper aware of like what is going to bring you like the satisfaction. And some people shouldn't play like a big game over a reality game. You can make $100,000, $200,000 a year in a business much easier than playing a game where you're trying to make $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, $10 million. If you're going to play that game, it's very, very different than the $100,000 game, right? Because $100,000 when you're trying to hit $5 million is nothing. If you're trying to hit $100,000, $200,000, that's very significant. And most people, I think, are dreaming of a $5 million business. And in reality, a $100,000, $200,000 business is actually what they want. And that doesn't mean that one has more value than the other. You can live very comfortably at both of them, but the game you play is much different. To make $5 million a year, you need a lot more hands. And so I also like helping entrepreneurs really think about like, what does success actually mean? Like, what is the life that you're shooting for? What is the happiness that you're going for? If you're really looking to build something big, then you have to understand that you make a lot more sacrifices. Like happiness is so far down the line for you that you have to understand that like gets shoved so far down that if you're shooting for a big thing, you have to really be critical. You have to analyze a lot deeper. You have to be very chest focused, and you're probably not going to see the fruit for much longer. And that's much harder than I think people expect it to be. Especially me. Like when I first started, I was like, oh, we're gonna make $1 million next year. You know what I mean? That's what I thought. I was like, oh, this is a fantastic idea. We're gonna modernize this. Cool. Didn't happen. And so like the reality, if I would have known to be more realistic, or maybe I wouldn't have been, to be honest, but like if I would have just been able to have some of the perspective I have now, I think I would have been able to pace a lot better and have a better expectation. And so I try to give that a lot to entrepreneurs now, even if they are trying to do the big thing. I'm like, okay, awesome. Just know like it sucks for a majority of it. And then hopefully it'll realize.
This special podcast episode is built by the Lancaster County Community Foundation, which uses the transformational potential of community-based philanthropy and the power of endowment to help shape a Lancaster County where every individual is valued, has a sense of belonging, and has the opportunity to thrive. Thank you to our friends at the Lancaster County Community Foundation for making it possible to provide access to training and lending for entrepreneurs. Yeah, you say you're delusional, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, yes, you're a little bit delusional, but also very self-aware, right? So the reality forecasting comes from being self-aware enough to know what game do I want to play, where do I want to go, and a lot of times, especially with entrepreneurship, it's the easiest way where people can trip up themselves to love the idea more than the action that it takes to achieve that idea. How important is self-awareness alongside the delusion?
I think, super critical because self-awareness is, I think, tied to leadership. And I don't think that I'm an expert leader, but I would hope that as I mature, it does become a defining trait for me. Like I would hope that's a superpower I gain at one point. And I think that everything I've learned about leadership is that self-awareness, especially when you're building something, helps you have a lot better perspective, right? So like you give an assignment to somebody, and this is the one that I work on the most. You give an assignment to somebody who you've hired and they don't execute it the way that you want it. You have two routes to go, right? You can blame or you can ask yourself, did you give that person everything that they would have needed to execute it the way that you expected it? And I find in my reflections, when I run into that situation, I did not set the expectation correctly. Like I just assumed, I was like, oh, I've seen them do other stuff. They'll be fine. Just good. So I'm learning that self-awareness is not just like, got to be aware of me and how I'm running and how I'm pacing and how I'm doing this, but it's also self-awareness when you're working and collaborating with other people, making sure that you're setting people up for success, that you're setting an expectation right. And a lot of times I think it's easy to be in the race of it and like, somebody doesn't do something right, so you're immediately jumping to like their fault. When I find in both my experience talking to people who've worked for other people and my own experience hiring, it's like it's usually me. Like it usually starts at the top. And there's a gift in giving people clarity, and you're not going to be able to really give people clarity unless you're self-aware.
And it sounds like you take a lot of ownership in a lot of the decisions you make. How important is ownership or taking ownership?
Ownership is big. I'm a big Navy SEAL guy. I don't know if people know. Like, I don't think people would expect that about me. I'm super into Navy SEAls.
Why is that?
Because they're just so intense, and ownership is such a big thing in the SEALs. And so, like, I read a lot of Navy SEAls books. You know, one of the famous ones is like Extreme Ownership, right? Most people know about that book. And like those concepts, that idea, how you kind of own everything in your world, I think it really changes how you play. Because then even if somebody else is like technically like at fault, you learn to not view it like that, right? You view everything within a chain, right? And so instead of seeing, I don't know, maybe something get edited wrong or something go out that I feel like wasn't really that good, I have to ask myself different questions now than just like, oh, I feel like they were lazy on that. And so I think it's huge. I think that's the only way to like build a team that enjoys you also. Like if you don't have a lot of ownership, your employees aren't going to love you.
Yeah. And well, a value that I hear used a lot is accountability. And we recently updated our values at Assets, and one of them is ownership. And one of the reasons we talk about is that if someone has to hold you accountable, it's probably too late. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather, we should strive to be a team where we're all taking ownership. We're able to recognize when a mistake was made or when we slipped up on something, take responsibility, and then figure out how do we develop a solution for it.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think that piece in ownership has always resonated, I know, with me and the team, and figuring out like, hold on, let's be proactive about this rather than someone else having to come to us about it.
Absolutely. And you're really good at that. I mean, I feel like you've modeled that in a lot of your attributes in life.
No,
and so
appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I learned a lot from even just the gram. Just follow the lifestyle.
Follow me on IG.
Exactly. Here's the plug.
So let's go back. I'm interested about, you mentioned a lot about rejection and your upbringing, and how it's translated into almost a superpower in overcoming that as an entrepreneur. A lot of the work that you do does include racial dynamics in it, right? Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about the racial dynamics around not only adoption, but even in your journey as an entrepreneur.
So in adoption is easier to start with. In adoption, like interracial adoption and adoption across racial lines is so common, right? We see it depicted on TV. It's not an unusual thing for most people to run into. And so that has always been a very kind of like normalized part of my life, even though it's included a lot of cultural loss for me. And so it's I think it's an interesting part of my work because racial dynamics are very politicized nowadays. I feel like the work that we do at Identity when it comes to like racial dynamics is not very political. It's not meant to be political because the truth of the matter is you're adopting a child of a different race. So your alignments don't really affect the fact that like their hair is different, their skin is different. Their culture of origin still exists, right? And so and if you grow up and you're a black kid growing up in a white community, like that one of one feeling has nothing political to do with it, right? And so I think something unique about our racial work is that it doesn't exist on a political side. We work with communities that are very conservative that we can actually help understand the importance of racial identity in a way that is not, I think, political, which I find to be very powerful, right? Like I've worked in racial justice. I've done Black Lives Matter stuff. Like I've been on the political side of it before. But to actually take a family and a community of people that would have maybe disregarded this, said it's not important, and actually get them to see the importance of it in a way that does not make them feel like, oh, they're liberal all of a sudden, has been really, really meaningful and interesting to me. Yeah. I think the racial work is very unique that we do. It's very different than what you might find. I mean, we just released a collection of hair care resources. And it's like, believe it or not, like if you've fostered or adopted over the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years, it's very unlikely that you ever got any training or resources on how to do your child's hair. Like probably none. And so like what we created is something that's really unique and seems like a huge gap. But because, again, these dynamics tend to be politicized, hasn't existed. And so we're able to kind of cut through a lot of this noise because so many people are bought into our brand that people are like, oh yeah, you're right. And we can also bring these resources at a really accessible price. And so I'd say that on the adoption side, that's kind of the racial dynamics and kind of some of the more unique stuff that I think we do there. You said on the rejection side,
or
as a business
as
owner?
an entrepreneur. So how's
entrepreneur?
that? Yeah. So you've carried
way worse. Being a black founder sucks. And I think because I grew up in such a white community, I did not think that it was going to suck for me. I thought I was going to still navigate the spaces as easily as I've always navigated white spaces. But white people do not want to give money to black people, like especially black founders. And so I found that to be very interesting and a rough dynamic to go through. And you know, I run a unique business, so like there's some of those implications as well. It's a harder to understand business off the bat, but I have noticed like I'm a part of a lot of black startup stuff, and I've noticed like, oh yeah, we're all experiencing like the same kind of looks, the same kind of push away, and the same kind of doubt, right? That wasn't my experience growing up, so I still have a lot of like weird confidence in those rooms because like I grew up in white spaces, and that's not an unusual space for me. But I find that to like be my experience as a black founder, like being able to navigate the rooms comfortably. I'm still getting the same no's as everybody else. I'm still not getting the same opportunities as everybody else. But at least I can comfortably move through the spaces. But yeah, I mean, being I think a founder of color in general carries like a really complicated, I don't know, road. You know, it definitely has a bias to it, but I mean, it's just like money has trailed how it's trailed for a long time. And so to break that up is really, really hard, especially when you don't have, you know, startups are inherently risk. And so there's a lot of money that goes into some really risky ideas. But usually when you're investing in these really risky ideas, you're investing partially in like name, family, other people around it, people to be able to save the company as well. Like, so when you're raising around, you know what I mean, there's all these dynamics at play.
And you're speaking specifically like venture capital.
Yeah, venture capital, even like angel investing too, unless you're going to just go one or two angels. I mean, investors are going to think about this from multiple dynamics. So they're going to think about likelihood of success, so like likelihood of success, return on investment, standard metrics. But those are all probabilities, right? You're assuming that all the things are going to work out or that they're going to figure it out. But in the very likely case that it doesn't work, you want some kind of reassurance, right? So how likely is somebody to buy out the idea? How valuable is like the scrapes of the business going to be for me to get my money back? How likely is somebody else that's on the cap table maybe going to have an option for it to go to another place? These are the things that like investors are going to think about. And when you take a founder of color who may not come from an affluent background, right? Doesn't come from a background of the business world. Maybe is the first person in their family to go to college or to even start a business like this. The likelihood of them having those connections are few, right? So then your odds just went down by a bunch, because you take a family with a dad who owns a company, he has his friends, his son starts a company, whether the dad gives him any money or not, you know, like, okay, there's these connections around it. And so these are all the dynamics that are actually at play that I think maybe don't get talked about enough or don't get thought about enough. They're important dynamics. Like, just to be frank, like identity right now is thinking about investing in projects and things like that. And like now I'm on the other side of that table, taking these pitches and like wondering, okay, if this fails, maybe this is bad to say out loud, but I was thinking like, if this fails, like what of it does make sense for us to still retain? Like, so if we invest into this project and it fails completely, are the scraps still valuable enough for us to twist around and turn something into? Like, that's an investor mindset. And so when you're a founder of color, I think if you don't have these abilities to kind of make even trash become treasure, it's really, really hard. Yeah. It's really, really hard.
So even as an investor thinking beyond the fundamentals.
You have to think way beyond the fundamentals, because there's a lot of great businesses that fail, right? We see them all the time. We see a lot of companies that seem like they should be very successful raise hundreds of millions of dollars and fail, right? Those investors, sometimes they lose money. Like, I'm not saying that investors never lose money, but the strategy behind, you know, private equity and behind venture capital, even behind angel investing, if you're smart, is that you have the fail safes, right? You don't invest, you know, $20 million into a company to lose it. You know, somewhere down the line, that money is going to come back to you, or you can save it somehow, some way. And like, that's the strategy of it all. You don't want to lose the money. I'm not saying it never happens, definitely does. But if you're a smart investor, you know that like this person is going to be able to have at least something valuable enough to get bought up by the next guy. Yeah. A great example of this is, have you seen the Humane pin?
I haven't, no.
So the Humane pin was like an AI pin that has like a little camera you pin it on.
Yes. Okay. More returns than sales recently.
Yes, more returns than sales.
Yeah.
They've raised, I think, like 350 million for it, and they're trying to sell right now for $1 billion, right? So if you were in that round, you're still going to make money, right? So they still have an underlying value that an investor can exit out on positively. Will they get that much? I mean, maybe. It depends on how much they have some underlying value in. But like, that's the kind of nuts and bolts of thinking, is like, you raise 350 million on a product that's very evidently failing. It's being more returned than bought, but you're still going to try to exit for about $1 billion, which will still give those investors a return. Yeah. And so like, you know, it's like that kind of game is like, that's really hard if you don't have that education. Like, if you don't have that education, you don't know that. If you don't know that's how the game's played, if you don't know how to build your arsenal and deck and value around those things, it's very hard as a founder of color.
This episode is built by the Reimagining Our Community Giving Circle. The ROC Giving Circle is a way for the community to support BIPOC-owned small businesses through collective philanthropy. The Giving Circle is managed by the ROC cohort, and its purpose is to facilitate funding to initiatives that support BIPOC-owned small businesses. To learn more, visit roclancaster.org. So 2 questions. How are you navigating that personally now? Yeah. And then second, what advice would you give for first-generation entrepreneurs to think about this? Because the reality is a lot of folks from our community get into industries that are low barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And when we think about wealth creation, economic opportunity, it's going to happen in areas that are scalable. So you think about tech, you think about green energy, you think about manufacturing, but it requires sometimes a lot of that type of investment.
Absolutely.
So how are you navigating that personally, and what advice would you give for first-gen entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, my personal journey in it now is not to play the game with identity. And so I don't play that game with identity. I may one day, but in a very different way. Like if you're talking pre-seed and like seed investment round, that's pretty intense battleground area. I don't play with identity anymore. Not that I don't. I think like right now, more than ever, I maybe could. But I think that delivering value and making money is exceptionally better. Now, it doesn't help us get somewhere faster. Like I think we could move so much faster and make way more money if we had money. But the stress of raising for me, the dedication of it is really, really difficult. And I wouldn't mind doing it again if I thought it was the right move. But we're seeing so much success in like actually just selling. Like we're just selling and making money, which I find is like that's better business. And so if I want to raise down the line, I have much more leverage. I had no leverage when I first tried to raise. So I would have lost more than I would have gained, at least initially. And so personally, I don't like navigating it. I'm navigating it in another way, which is like I'm helping friends like put together decks. I'm helping people raise. I'm reviewing stuff myself. Like we're not necessarily investing in companies as much as media projects, but I've been getting much more involved in like, what does it look like for us to invest in this project? Like even, shows that are being pitched to go to higher networks, like how do we get involved in these things? So I'm getting to look at it from a different lens, which I really, really enjoy. I really hope like the end of my life is being a really good investor. And so I'm getting to kind of peek at that a little bit. Your second question about like people navigating the space, I think if you have to raise. I think if you can really figure out how to make money before it, like make money and be sustainable without it. It's not always the case. Like there's a lot of ideas that are really capital like heavy, and hopefully you can put together a deck that's like worthy enough to get some capital in, loan or something. But if you can just like provide value and just prove an idea out before you get to that point, I think it's like much stronger. I mean, I think pretty much anybody would tell you that. It's like just run out the idea, validate it, make sure it works, make some money. You have a better chance, I think, at getting investment, and you have more leverage in the investment room. If you're already making money, you don't need capital, you have much more leverage in the room. If you smell like you need money, you've lost in the room already. And so, I mean, being first gen is hard, but also a lot of education. There's a lot of communities for founders of color now. And so like I follow newsletters, and like for like a year of my life, I just read newsletters, read articles. I learned a ton about venture. I learned a ton about investing. And that all helped me kind of progress and move down the line. But you have to kind of go through that. You really don't want to get into a room with somebody who you have a good idea, but they're a smarter investor than you, and they take you for your business. Because that can happen. I mean, investors are really smart. And so if you're a really proficient like investor and you have somebody in a room who doesn't know anything about business, you can get taken advantage of really easily. And so understanding what you're walking into is also really important.
So not only thinking like an entrepreneur, but thinking like an investor.
Thinking like an investor. Very important. I mean, it also helps like when you're modeling, like if you're kind of doing some modeling on like how you're going to grow, it also helps to think like an investor, because that's what an investor is going to really think about. Your today is much less like my today numbers for identity matter much less to an investor than the growth of them, right? So they would look at how you got here, what it is today, and how likely is this audience to kind of go up. And so it also helps with that train of thought.
Good. Going back to the business, for those who don't know, you have a vlog series that covers, and you've done a lot of work with your own family in the business. Tell me about the family dynamics, getting your parents engaged in this work, and how's that been?
It's pretty unique. I mean, I felt like that's another thing that was kind of like just sitting on the back burner for a while, waiting for its time. But since a lot of my work has been initially in interracial adoption, and that's my story, I've really found a way to help that track of it grow by just incorporating my family into it. And so like me and my mom have a podcast, and we'll rotate different members of my family through it to just talk about our dynamics as an adoptive family, my experience as an adoptee, my siblings' experience. My parents have biological children and adopted children. So it's like interesting to get that perspective in there. It also helps, I think, with like uniqueness. Parenting content is kind of boring. Like parenting content is just not extremely unique. I mean, if you go on Instagram, TikTok, it might be more so, but when we think of like large parenting brands, like they're not super dynamic, I think, right now, and especially in adoption and foster care. And so I think for me, bringing my family into it and bringing like my family's personality into it is a part of also us differentiating ourselves as a brand, and saying like this is a much more authentic space. This is a much more vulnerable space. This is a real space. And I see that all the time, like people like laughing at the podcast or commenting like this reminds me of my family, versus it just being like, so like how did you feel? You know what I mean? Like it's you get these different dynamics in there that I think are really, really powerful and pull people into not only the learning of it, which I think is really important in what we do, like the learning and helping adoptive parents connect with their adopted children better. Like that's a really important part of what we do. But another really important thing of what we do is like build like a brand that people love. And I think that we do that by those moments. Like even our infertility stuff, like we had the author of our infertility guide. Instead of me on the podcast, I had her and my mom interview each other. And so we got to pull that same dynamic of closeness and family, but in a new way. And then I had her do an interview with my dad and my mom. And so like we can pull this out in different ways. And so it's just like taking that kind of unique heart, that thing that gets people more like that's me, and doing it a bunch of different ways, versus just, I think, saying the thing or sharing the thing. And both are valuable, but how we feel about them is very different.
Yeah. And I think that authenticity piece is the key right there. I think with your business, your brand, I think people feel that it's real and it's not, you could just tell the lived experience and expertise blended in together, which is super valuable for someone that's looking for that type of information.
Absolutely. I want our stuff to feel like it's your family.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really want it to feel like this is like, there's so much theory stuff in adoption, and like, it's been so valuable to the field because, people can learn, and adoptees and foster children tend to have a ton of different dynamics that play: attachment, behavioral. There's all these things that come into play for adopted and foster children, because they tend to experience some kind of trauma somewhere. If you can take that same knowledge and put it in a more fun vessel, I think it just creates a different type of engagement. And I'm really like, that to me is a big part of Identity's brand, and something that I have to really strategically think about. Like when we want to do something new, when we want to add a new dynamic, like I have to think about like, how am I going to incorporate that energy into this next thing that we want to do? And that's exciting. Like, all my future plans for us all like kind of tail that, like fun, different, outside of the box for adoption and foster care.
Love it. So what is the future of Identity? What does the future hold?
Yeah, the future holds a lot of things. I think that the main thing for us right now, and the main thing that I think is going to be really good for us, is really doubling in on content. We've put out a lot of content already, and I'm hoping to crank that like by a lot.
Yeah.
So both in acquiring podcasts that I think and shows that I think are like adjacent to our brand and really help us with that, and in development. So developing our own core shows, as well as having other people's shows that I think add to our brand. So that's really, to me, that's a lot of where my vision casting is, because it helps me accomplish some of the other stuff. And some of the other stuff that I would say is like product development. So we have 3 what we call practical guides, which are short parenting books that are meant to not be that kind of like the heavy theory that I talked about, but they're meant to take that kind of what you might find in our content and put it into much more practicality for parents. And so we sell those both kind of like to agencies and to states, and to like straight to parents. So we're gonna do one more by the end of the year. I won't say it because I'm not sure when this is coming out. But we're going to do one more by the end of the year. And then we're going to pause and do a bunch of content around all of them for about a year to a year and a half, and then develop more. And so that's kind of like, I think, my two biggest focus. On the back end of all of this, we do have a community for adoptive and foster parents. It's not a huge, I think, part of our public brand, but it tends to work really well in our B2B line. And so when we sell the guides to be used as training or post material to agencies and states, their families get access for a year for free. And so we actually have an online community that's growing and has, like, we can put all of our content through that vessel, and it's building a lot of value. Even though it's not our public facing thing, I think it'll grow over time. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like the house for all of our content, house for all of our resources. I mean, you only get access to that really right now if it's through your agency or state. Of course, you can go like buy a subscription, but I think it's kind of unique and cool that many families are in there because their agency is providing it for them. And that's my vision for my goal, and a lot of the work that we do is not that parents necessarily have to buy it. It's that, like, this is a part of becoming a parent. Like, if you're adopting or fostering, you should get this kind of stuff. And so, yeah. And we're going to do a lot of creative things. Let me just say that. Like, I want us to do like a conference in the next couple of years that's called Identity Fest. And like, it's going to be like a festival and a conference tied into one.
Nice.
Like that's the unique stuff that I think will really be dynamic about identity. We're I think appealing to a much younger generation of parents, as well as bringing like really meaningful adoptive and foster parenting in a way that is just, it fits us, that like kind of like quirky content and like funness and different stuff. And I'm excited about like how we're bringing that to life.
I love that. I can't end this without talking about some wrong advice that I might have given you. But I think it's important about trusting your gut and believing in your vision. So, a while back you had come to a group of us with an idea for an ebook. And a few of us were just like, that's not a good idea. You're going to distract yourself. And what happened from there?
Yes. So I'm going to give a little bit of the full story. This was like early identity days. I was running on E, it was not working. And I had the idea to write an ebook to really save, to get some money. We needed some money in the door. And I knew if I wrote just an ebook, maybe people would buy it and we'd have enough to stay afloat. I presented this idea to you in this group and everybody was like, no, it doesn't seem like the thing to do. Unbeknownst to them, I had really already written it. Like I'd already,
it's already done.
It was kind of already done. It was already in motion. And I put it out and I emailed a bunch of agencies and just told them that it was out. And within the first week, an agency emailed me back and they was like, hey, do you mind if we use this to train our families? Like, do you mind if we require families to buy this? Week later, another one. And another one. And so it started to cue this thing to me. I was like, oh, so you guys would not only buy this, but you would require this. And because it was in like this kind of like ebook book format, it was much more understandable for adoption agencies who were not excited about an app, but could get excited about an ebook or a book. And that was the first practical guide. That was the first practical guide. And if I had not written that, I'm not sure where we would be today, to be honest, because that completely changed the trajectory of the company, and the practical guides allow everything else in the company to happen. And so, yeah, it's crazy to think about.
I love it. I love being wrong. And if you follow Isaac on Instagram or Identity on Instagram, you'll see videos of you just like stuffing envelopes boxing up books, shipping them out. And it's a reminder every time of like, that's why he's an entrepreneur. It's being able to trust that gut. And yes, you take advice from folks and guidance, and but just knowing what's true in your heart and like, I'm going to move forward with this.
You have to know your market.
Committed.
Yeah. And so, I agree.
I love it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'm glad you've been around for a lot of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a privilege for sure.
Thank you.
So where can people connect with you, find you, find some of this wonderful content you're putting out there?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to issacetter.com, Isaac_Etter on Instagram. And if you want to see just like identity focused stuff, it'd be identitylearning.co, C-O, or identity.learning on Instagram.
Awesome. And the YouTube series as well.
Yeah, Identity Learning on YouTube. Yeah.
So really, really cool vlog series that you have out there.
Yeah, thank you.
To get an inside look. So
yeah,
appreciate you. Thanks
There'll
for joining
be more.
us.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks. That brings us to the end of another episode of Built by Us. A huge thank you to Issac Etter for sharing his incredible story and the work he's doing to uplift our community. If you were inspired by today's conversation, be sure to follow Issac's journey and support his initiatives. And don't forget to join us next time as we continue to highlight the stories of local entrepreneurs who are shaping our future. Until then, I'm Jamie Arroyo, and this is Built by Us.
This is the Built by Us podcast, brought to you by Assets. Visit us at assetspa.org to learn more about the products and services we provide, and you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube.